the topic of teas, right? Transcendence and so forth. So my offering here has to do with manipulation, clearly. So manipulation is a topic of deep import to the conference. I'd like to thank the conference organizers for permitting me to share my perhaps a little controversial thoughts about this. So with that, I'll jump in. So I'd like to bring to your attention that my background is actually from the Greek magical papyri. This is a love spell, and love spells are going to take an enormous part of this little chat. So my agenda here speaks to the fact that I heard somebody speaking at one point about using a Strophalos to compel a deity. And I thought to myself, you know, that doesn't sound just right to me. And although I'm not a formally trained historian, all of the manuscripts are there. I have a couple friends who are classicists who gave me some little tips and tricks about how to look into this. And I discovered some things that maybe you'll be interested to hear. Firstly, we're going to talk about two spinning ritual devices that were well known in late antiquity and the kind of early Roman period. The first one is called the yinks. This is actually the root of the word jinx, right? To jinx means to kind of be hexed by the universe. And the Strophalos, which is the device that I had my nose in out of joint about. The Strophalos is another rotary ritual tool that we'll hear about. And because those things are devices that spin on a cord, people have confused them a bit. And I will say that modern practitioners have conflated these in a really terrible way. And all of us together are going to separate them usefully. Because they have different uses, they come from different periods of time, they were used by different classes of people, and further, they were never used to compel any deities, but instead to compel people to do really crazy things. The Strophalos is probably the cleanest of all of this stuff and the latest, and I think, although I can't really prove this through manuscripts, but I think you can make a decent argument that they were actually used in initiations into the Greek mystery cults. So my methods, all of the manuscripts are around. Further, there is a database that's called the TLG and a database search engine called Diogenes that will allow you to look for all of these Greek words and determine when the first occurrence was and how many occurrences there were after that. The word yinks, yinges, and Strophalos in the second bullet were principally studied. The word yinks appears in Pindar, who's going to be a friend of ours before we're over here. And that happens in about 480 BCE. And the last time it was used was a description of the rain miracle, and I'll tell you about that. It's just right silly in the 2nd century CE, in Rome, in fact. The use of the plural yinges is kind of a linchpin in my argument here. Yinges used later in the Chaldean oracles, which is where most of us know about this. It has a completely different usage than early, where it's a propitiator for love spells. And then in the last bullet, the first use of Strophalos occurs in the Chaldean oracles, and we'll talk about that in a sec. And just a nod to JD, Strophalos is still a word in modern Greek, and it's a crankshaft. So the yinks. The yinks is a wheel-shaped disc, and we'll actually see one functioning in a movie. But you can see the little angelic earring over here on the far right has in its lap a little circular doodad, and that doodad spins as you pull the threads in and out. And Pindar actually has a deep story about how this type of device was brought into Jason's life by Aphrodite. And then in Pindar, there's this really outrageous version of the Argonautica where Medea's actually not a protagonist anymore. It's stunning. We'll talk more about that. I forgot my second bullet here. The word yinks actually is a name from mythology, and yinks actually appears when the girl, Yinks, magically drew the attention of Zeus. And you know what happens when you do that? Hera either turns you into an animal or a rock. In this case, she turned Yinks into this bird called a wryneck. A wryneck is a bird with some really peculiar mating properties. When they are attempting to attract their mate, they writhe. They have a long neck, and it's kind of snake-like. It's quite eerie. So remember that when we get to Pindar, and you'll be happy. Pindar is the first instance of the use. Theocritus, the Yinks appears in 2 of the idols, and this is 3rd century BCE. Idol 2 is called the spell, and is one of the most outrageous erotic binding spells you'll ever see. If you want to make someone really miserable and then make yourself really miserable, you can go and read this Theocritus spell. It's stunning and it's terrifying. So after the more traditional uses where modern practitioners developed the notion that this thing could be used to compel a goddess, yinks actually turns into a metaphor in later manuscripts for compelled action. And so Plutarch uses the word yinks and yinges to extol the virtues of geometry. Most people don't buy that. But then even later in early Rome, Origen describes Jesus as having yinks-type qualities in his speech. So about Greek love spells. So ladies and gentlemen, Greek love spells are not, meaning they're basically erotic binding spells. And what they're meant to do is to trap a person into being your other person, or maybe love slave. I think we can't read this red stuff very well, so I'll help you out. So the figure over here on the left is found in a jar, and it's clearly not roses, it's not chocolate. This is actually a ceramic figure that's been pierced by a whole lot of iron rods, and it was found in a vase, and you'll never guess what was found in there. It was a lead tablet, and we all know what that means. What was written on the lead tablet is basically this. It's a curse, and I'll read this. Drag her by her hair, by her guts, until she does not stand aloof from me, until I hold her obedient for the whole time of my life. So this is what is meant by an ancient Greek love spell. Just keep that in mind while we roll forward. So now back to Pindar. Remember that I said Pindar is the first known incidence of this. The piece that this is mentioned in first is called Pythian 4, and it's really strange. So modern practitioners have cherry-picked out about 3 sentences from this Pindar piece, which is, 700 lines long. There was a lot of it. And they've decided that because in this line, Aphrodite comes to Jason with the bird tacked onto a 4-spoked wheel, that this is actually a way to summon deity. But here, let's talk about the Pythian 4. Firstly, Pindar was the Tom Stoppard of his time. The manuscript describes a chariot race victory, and there's very little of it that follows. It's basically incoherent. Further, Pindar was actually known to be very interested in the politics of Cyrene at that time, and so the whole ode is this weird mix of epic poetry and a description of the climate at the time. We know that the Pythian 4 and Pythian 5 were commissioned by someone, someone who probably benefited a whole lot from this description. So, and further, the presence of the yinks here, the audience knew the Argonautica story, and so they understood when it was twisted in the manuscript. The audience also understood that the presence of yinks was probably not a really groovy thing. And lastly, I want to bring your attention to the vase on the right. The only wheels in ancient Greek art that have 4 spindles like this, do I say more about that? The four spokes, they're chariot wheels. And so what I think happened here is that Pindar is actually referring to the Rheineck and the 4-spoked wheel because this thing is an epic about a chariot race, and not because it is an epic about how to, summon deity. So the next mention that I gave, Theocritus, Theocritus has a whole bunch of idols, and he's a bucolic poet. And so what he's talking about is what people in, basically in rural Greece and the nearby area were doing. So we can count on Theocritus to basically give us folk magic. And so what we're seeing here is a piece from this very long manuscript about a girl named Samitha who lays a fire spell on her neglectful lover, who happens to be a young athlete named Delphus. And she's sitting at a crossroads. She has a little shrine. The little shrine is to Hecate. And the maid is spinning yinks. The whole thing, throughout the whole idol, she's spinning a yinks. And Samitha says, amongst other things, I'll put the spell of fire onto him. And she's spinning and spinning. Rheineck, Rheineck, draw him hither. Rheineck, Rheineck, draw him hither. So now that we've seen a little bit about the history, the manuscript history of the Rheineck and the yinks, I wanted to show you kind of what they looked like. The way that we see them nowadays, they actually are present as a toy. And you can see, you spin it, and the 2 strings, they develop stress in them. You pull it apart, and then the central button spins. And depending on the geometry of the outer part of the button, it makes this really weird sound. It's like a moan. And so you've all heard a bull roarer, right? So you spin it, and it makes this wheeze. So the yinks is kind of similar to that. It makes a noise. It makes a compelling noise. It makes a compelling noise that makes people do silly things in love spells, in fact. There are other examples of yinks, yunges, let's call them. And if you live near Boston, you can go see one. And here's a picture I took at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts that houses a horizontal example. And I would say that the actual history, as we know it now, of yinks and yunges was started by this character whose name was Gao, who stumbled upon this thing and was very curious about Theocritus. Okay, so I want to bring this to your attention. So while Theocritus was 3rd century BCE, it's folk magic. And the type of folk magic that's given in Theocritus is also really well represented in the Greek magical papyri, which is, as I'm probably completely speaking to the choir, the converted here, but it's a collection of spells that were not necessarily written by the same person, but packaged up. And they're clearly spells written by practitioners for clients, because there are gaps in those spells for people to put names. If you'd like to hear more about the Greek magic papyri, a whole set of them was recently published by Hans-Dieter Betz and Brian Alt, who is a PhD from Purdue, is almost finished with an interlinear version. So let's move back into what time was like here. I mean, most people were illiterate. They didn't get to write the spells themselves. They didn't get to go on the internet find them, darn it. So they had to have somebody do this work for them. And a good 25% of the spells in the Greek magical papyri are erotic binding spells. There are also aphrodisiac spells and a bunch of other ones, but trapping and keeping people for the purposes of having relationships or sex, super common in the ancient world. Oops. I rather wish I hadn't done that. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the plural case. And I was telling you that the final extant instance of the word yinks is, as a magical device, is clear out in basically 200 CE, where Julian of Chaldean oracles fame actually saved a Roman army from being destroyed by firstly the enemies and secondly by thirst. That is the final use of the word yinks according to the TLG and Diogenes. The Chaldean oracles, on the other hand, which are products of 2nd or 3rd century CE, they contain the first instance of the word Strophalos. So basically, the word yinks, as a spinny doodad to compel somebody, fell out of use, and the word Strophalos came into use at a similar time. Strophalos is not the yinks, though. Well, and we can see by looking at the Chaldean oracles, or the fragments thereof, right? We don't have complete versions of those, which is terrible. It is used as a theurgic, in a theurgic manner, right? So to gain unity with a god. And strangely, in the Chaldean oracles, here we find Hecate again. This Hecate is notably different than the Hecate seen in the era of the Yanks, in that now all of a sudden Hecate is a celestial being and no longer a chthonic one. And an argument can be made that this particular Hecate is actually an Assyrian fire goddess, but I'll certainly be struck by lightning if I bring that up here. In any case, the Strophalos is always used with a supplicatory prayer, and there's never any compulsion involved. No compulsion to people, no compulsion to gods. It's completely safe, maybe. Yungis are also seen in the oracles, but by the time of the oracles, the meaning has actually been converted into connective forces. So no longer is it a spinny toy for torment and transcendence. It's a force, which is really strange. I don't think people really understand how that happened. It would be a really good PhD project, I guess. But to put this whole notion of compelling deities with spinny doodads, Iamblichus does a fine job, and he says that only Egyptians do that. We would never do that because it's not theurgy. Okay, but let me remind you what theurgy is. And I stole this from Wikipedia brutally this morning. Sorry. It's a practice of rituals with the intention of achieving unity with a god. It's like about as far away magically from an erotic binding spell as you can get. And further, Proclus is just one of the million Neoplatonists who talk about this kind of thing. Theurgy is a power higher than all human wisdom, used for in operations of divine possession. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So let's talk about mystery cults. And this is too short, and it's not enough, and I'm sorry you'll be left hungering for more. It's the nature of the half-hour talk, I think. But let's just talk for a sec about what initiation into the mystery cults looked like at this time period. Here we see Hades taking Persephone away. Actually, I think he pulled up in a limo and she hopped in, but for the purposes of mythology, we'll keep the statue. But the Orphics, and then subsequently the people who developed the Dionysian mystery cults, they revered Dionysus and Persephone because they descended into the underworld, and then voila, they came back. So this actually got turned into a central focus of Orphism, where the initiatory process actually followed the death of the god and then the resurrection of the god. And so here down here at the bottom, I want to bring your attention to the fact that these initiations were ritual purifications, and basically they were a little bit like the Tibetan, the Egyptian book of Going Forth by Day, right? These are lessons in how to die well. And people who went through these initiations were no longer afraid to die. And I think it was generally thought that provided proof of efficacy. So if we keep that in mind and ask the question, well, okay, so there's this thing called the Strophalos, which is supposed to be a great big fancy ball with a sapphire in the middle. So what is that doing in the Chaldean oracles? There's some really new, interesting research about toys in the presence of these initiatory rituals. And it turns out, as you saw in the previous slide, when Dionysus, the way Dionysus goes to the underworld is that he's torn into pieces by the Titans. And the Titans actually tease him into that position with toys, with spinny toys like rhomboids. And then there were also little cones, dolls, golden apples, a mirror, and knuckle bones. And so lots of people think that these were important ritual items in the initiations themselves. Some people think that they were passwords or test phrases. So any of you who have been initiated into, let's use the OTO as an example because that's familiar to me. You have to know how to get into the temple, and there's the series of things that you do to show that you're prepared. And some folks think that all these little ritual objects were the way to get into the temple. And in point of fact, the Gura papyrus, which is the principal way that any of us know about Orphism, a ritual is described there that indicates possibly that these toys were involved. Oops. Okay, so a little bit more about the Orphic mysteries. Clement of Alexandria, who was a Christian apologist for all this stuff and said not very nice things about the initiations, was really good at cataloging all of the things that were known at this time about the initiations. And he has plotted for us that the Titans lured Dionysus with all these toys. And then he lists the objects which are tokens of this sacrament. And he uses those words. So knucklebone ball, strabolos, which in this case, it's spelled differently and it means a pine cone. This word actually is present in the Greek magical papyri, where strophalos and yinks are not, another mystery, and some other things. And why is it that we don't know any more about this? I mean, shoot, all of the OTO initiations are online. You can find them if you want. But people were really good at keeping the contents of these initiations a secret. Probably no internet, but also they found these things to be really important. And so they found them so important that they shut up about the initiation rituals. And on the right-hand side, I had to do this. That's Dionysus, and he has red hair. Right? You get that was important to me. And another instance of people talking about these ritual initiation devices is Apuleius. So in the Golden Ass, he talks all about this. And I have been initiated into blah, blah, blah. Nothing like magicians online these days, I know. But let's see here. What he's saying over here in the red, sorry about that. What he's saying is that people keep some of these little toys wrapped in linen in places of honor in their house. So, people use them in ritual, people keep them around, and they've been identified as possibly important in the initiation rituals, and they involved a spinny doodad. So I think actually, there is evidence to imply, maybe support is a strong word, that the Strophalos actually is present as an indication of spiritual authority, and such that the people who had all the spinning doodads and the toys in the little linen sacks actually kept all that stuff as proof of ritual authority. They were kept to provide a sign to the deity, but also to other magicians, that a person had authority to make requests of gods. And that actually is the end of my discussion, my argument. Nobody else says Strophalos has anything to do with the mystery, the initiations in the mystery cults. I'll continue to work on it and then irritate you later with results. I want to give some gratitude besides my thanks to the conference organizers. I talked with a lot of people about this, and I want to give thanks to each and every one of them, my ritual partners and my intellectual compadres. Without them, I would be zilch. And may they be loved and honored by the gods as I want to bless you. I would like to actually acknowledge the fact that Typhon is a bud and Hecate is very close to my heart, and that the person who drew this gorgeous Hecate picture is actually sitting right over there. Thank you, Red. And okay, if you want more Harper, there's more Harper out there. Peter Mark Adams allowed me to write an appendix for a book that's coming out pretty soon. This particular work actually has been written up and accepted by Hadean Press. I have some other things going on down here, and I have a ThelemaCON lecture and a Magical Women Salon in the near future. And with that, thanks a whole bunch, and I can answer questions.